Hey guys, the first poem this week is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. A few things I want to go over before we start the poem is a little bit of biographical information about Percy Shelley. He was an English romantic poet. You probably don't recognize his name, but you may recognize his second wife's name. His second wife was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Frankenstein has become a huge part of culture both in England and in the United States. Many movies and many books have been written about Frankenstein and through the influence of Frankenstein. But anyway, Percy Shelley was a very political writer, and during the Romantic period in England, there were a lot of poets who were political writers. And he was very anti-monarchy, anti-king, in other words, or queen. He was against the idea of one person ruling over a country or a large group of people, and that shows up a lot in his poetry. Ozymandias, let's talk about that name. That is another name for Ramses II, who is an Egyptian pharaoh. Most scholars and historians believe that Ramses II, Ozymandias, was the Egyptian pharaoh of Exodus in the Bible. And so obviously that Ramses refused to let the Israelites go. He was very much in love with control, very much in love with himself, and that will make more sense when we read the poem. So we talked about this a little bit last week, but when we're referring to the speaker in poetry, we don't call that speaker a narrator like we do with a novel or with a short story. Rather, it's just the speaker. So if we're writing about poetry, we would refer to the person talking in this poem as the speaker. Now, we really have three parties in this poem. We have the speaker, we have a traveler, okay, and we have a sculptor. Okay, those are the three people we have in the poem. Ozymandias in the poem is no longer a person, but rather the ruins of a statue. And we'll talk more about that. Another thing I want you to recognize about this poem that I hope that you think about when you look at a poem, I hope you look at how many stanzas it has, what its structure is like. This poem is one stanza and it is 14 lines. And so you should recognize and know that that is a sonnet. Anytime you have a poem that's 14 lines, it's called a sonnet. And there are two main types of sonnets. There are Shakespearean sonnets and there are Italian sonnets. This poem most closely represents an Italian sonnet because the first 8 lines and the last 6 lines are separated. There's a shift between those two, and we'll talk about that as we get into the poem. Okay, I'm going to read this and we'll talk about it, not necessarily line by line, but we'll dive a little bit deeper into the poem. So the speaker says, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, so we know that our speaker, we can tell by where these quotation marks are here, and they don't end until at the very end of the poem. So the traveler in this poem is telling our speaker a story. So he comes from an antique land, and that was another trend during the Romantic time period in England. Writers would write from a more exotic setting, not just England. So anyway, this traveler said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk in the sand, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. I'll stop there. So far, our traveler has said that during his travels in the desert, the middle of the desert, in the sand, half sunken in the sand, is the ruin of a statue. The whole statue is not there anymore. It's trunkless. There's no body to the statue. It's 2 huge legs of stone, and near them on the sand, a shattered face. Visage is a word that we don't use anymore. That means face. And on that face is a frown, a wrinkled lip, and a sneer of cold command. So this face, this statue, I want you to think of it like a satirical portrait. If you don't know what a satirical portrait is, that's a portrait that's made of someone and it's exaggerated in some way, either to make fun of them or to reveal their character in some fashion or another. A good example of this in recent years, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the president who most people have really strong feelings about. They are either really love Donald Trump and really admire him and think he was a great president, or they don't like him at all. And so I've seen in recent years, and even when he was actually president, a lot of satirical portraits of him, either bobbleheads or posters, all kinds of things, Halloween mask even, that have Donald Trump with kind of a reddened faced appearance, angry, maybe sneering in some way. And those are not made by Donald Trump's supporters, but rather by people who are criticizing him and trying to create a portrait of him that sheds a negative light on President Donald Trump. And so that's how I think of Ozymandias. On his face is a sneer, and his lip is wrinkled up in this power-hungry, commanding manner. And the person who decided to portray him that way is our sculptor. So this sculptor, well, those passions read, that sculptor recognized that this ruler was cruel. He was commanding. He didn't like this ruler. So he mocked the ruler. I imagine the ruler asking the sculptor to sculpt his portrait. And instead of making it the way that Ozymandias wanted him to, he decided to do a portrait in this sculpture that portrayed who he really was. And honestly, Ozymandias Ramses was probably so consumed with himself that he didn't even realize he was being mocked. But the traveler and the speaker seemed to admire the sculptor who had the nerve to mock Ozymandias in this sculpture. We kind of switch gears after, and underneath this is a whole different poem, so don't let that confuse you. We're going to switch gears here, and it tells us what it says underneath the statue on the pedestal. And on the pedestal, these words appear. Quote, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And so these are the words that Ozymandias obviously chose to put on his statue. And it's obvious through those words that he wants his people to be in awe of him, to think that he has omnipotent power, that he is eternal, an eternal earthly king. He refers to himself as the King of Kings, and most of us have probably heard that term before when referring to God, the God of Abraham, the God of the Bible. And so Ozymandias obviously wants people to think that he is God, that he is their God. In his eyes, he is God. And he thinks that this statue will be everlasting, that his reach and his influence will be everlasting, his power. But here's the part of the poem that I love. The last 3 lines, we switch gears again. The traveler still speaking to the speaker of the poem. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay is a word that indicates death, that indicates something, rotting, something that's no longer alive. That colossal wreck, meaning the statue, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. So this king who wanted this himself immortalized in this statue believed the statue would last forever, that he would last forever. But now all that remains on earth of Ozymandias is this shattered, broken statue in the middle of the desert that no one save this traveler sees. So his influence on earth is gone. And that's something, we all have to face at some point or another. We don't live on earth forever. We don't have eternal earthly life. None of us do. And so Ozymandias obviously thought he was above other people. He didn't think that he was mortal. And now all that is left of him is this ruin of a statue. So his power and his control was very finite. It didn't last. And so this is both a poem that is a social comment on the evils, I guess, of the monarchy. At the time that Shelley wrote this, the King of England was not popular. He was known to be very self-serving. He did not serve his people. And so it's both to comment on that, and I think it's about the brevity of life, that life is brief, that we don't have eternal influence on earth. We may feel that we do, but no one is better than anyone else. No one has that eternal influence, especially someone who is self-serving and wastes the time of his rule on himself and trying to gain admiration of his people without serving them.